Good afternoon, and on such a beautiful weekend day, thank you for coming and hanging out with us in an auditorium all afternoon. My name is Georgina Goodlander. I'm the exhibition coordinator for the Art of Video Games. I also manage web and social media at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Just going to give a brief introduction to kind of talk about how we came to want to do this program out of working on the exhibition, and then I'll introduce our first panel. So, has everyone here seen the exhibition? Has anybody not? Raise your hand. Couple? Okay, head up there afterwards. We're open till 7. But just a bit of background. The exhibition is about the evolution of video games as an artistic medium, thinking about the entire video game experience as an artwork, not just looking at graphics or concept art, but the entire experience. And so the exhibition includes a huge amount of different kinds of assets, from game footage, screen captures, digital concept art, physical concept art, artifacts, and then the actual games themselves. So there was a lot of research and background we had to do before we could even start putting this together, including getting licenses for every single one of the games, not just the games that are in the exhibition, but the 240 games that were included in the public vote in 2011. I like emphasizing that because I was responsible for getting those licenses, and it was a huge, huge task. But one thing it did teach me is I was really surprised that game companies didn't have their content for older games. They just didn't have it. They didn't have records. They didn't really care about the older games, or at least that was the impression I got from having conversations with them. And it really shocked me. All of the game footage and game captures that you see in the exhibition, the curator did, essentially. We didn't get any of that from the game companies because they didn't have that content. In many cases, it was really difficult to find out who even owned a particular game. And the company that originally published it, either I couldn't find them, or if I could find them, they didn't know who currently owned it. It was a very it was an eye-opening experience for me to realize that this is not something the game industry is currently doing or caring about. Therefore, is it up to the museums to be doing it? I think it is, and that's what we're going to be talking about. In an ideal world, this is how we would have exhibited the games, to me. With all artworks, it's about kind of going back to what the artist originally intended and using the hardware, the display concept that was available at the time that the artwork was produced. So in reality, we should be showing games from the late 70s and early 90s on CRT monitors, and it would be particularly wonderful if we could do what they did at this year's MagFest on the left and kind of recreate little living room environments for people to play these games as they would have been played when they were released. For many reasons, we were unable to do that, and this is more what our playable games look like. And this is because this exhibition is on view here for nearly 7 months. We anticipate at least 750,000 people going through the show and pounding on the equipment. But then not only that, is after it leaves here, it goes on a 10-city tour of the US through January 2016. This has to stand up to that travel. It has to be able to go on trucks and travel around the country and be used by, be used by millions of people. So we did make some compromises in the display of the exhibition. So with the playable games, while the display that you're looking at is contemporary because it's being fed through projectors, we are using original hardware to feed those games. That was a very difficult challenge. Here you're seeing the hardware on the left for Pac-Man. It's the original kind of circuit board from the arcade cabinet, about 30, 35 years old. Very, very brittle connections on that. And then we're running it through a computer so that we can have a timeout for people in the galleries. We can't let you play Pac-Man for hours. We can have some instructions. We can but we wanted to use the original hardware because that's what the artwork is. It's what it was originally made of. On the other side is the kind of component system for Super Mario Brothers on the NES, running off an original NES. The reason we included playable games in the exhibition is because this is an art exhibition, and to us, the player is a critical component of that artwork. Everybody who plays a video game has a slightly different experience of it. So we really wanted to allow our visitors to have that kind of experience of the games in the gallery. But then we also recognize that we're a national museum, we're a busy museum, and that we only have 5 playable games in the show, so we really wanted to open up those experiences and allow multiple people to watch, even if one person can only play at a time. As with the other games too, the games that we display through video footage, we did capture that footage using the original hardware, but we're displaying it on contemporary monitors and projections. And that's my bit. So it gives me great pleasure to invite our first set of panelists up to the stage, led by Tiarna Doherty. If you want to head up here. So the big questions that we want to ask are, what are museums' responsibilities when it comes to video games? I think it's a wonderful achievement that the Smithsonian American Art Museum has had an exhibition about video games, but we don't currently have any plans to acquire video games and have them part of our permanent collection, should we? And if we did, what would that mean? So, Tiarna?
Thank you, Georgina. Can everyone hear me on my microphone? Oh, now I hear myself. Okay, very good. Good morning. Or good afternoon. I want to just mention, I think everyone should have picked up a program outside. And inside the program are extensive little sort of bio descriptions of everyone speaking today. And I'm going to ask at some point for our panelists to share with you a little information about their jobs, because everyone here has a very different role or job that is connected to preserving video games in some way, which makes our discussions really interesting. We did have the chance to spend the morning together, along with some of our panelists who are going to be speaking later. So we've been able to address a number of questions, and we want to readdress those first here on the stage, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience, and we really, really do look forward to that. To begin, I'll introduce myself in a way. I'm the Chief of Conservation here at the American Art Museum, and that means I have to supervise the conservation and restoration of everything that we have. And for those of you who've been through the museum, you know that that ranges from traditional art, maybe a sculpture in bronze, to TV screens and installations of LED lighting. And so there are a lot of challenges in preserving these materials. And to become a conservator, one has to study science as much as a pre-med student, studio arts, so you understand what all of the materials are used in art, whether it's paint or plastic. And you also have to study chemistry, a little physics, biology, and art history. For some people, the art history could be the history of sculpture. For somebody else, it could be the history of film and video. And now it could be the history of video games. So in thinking about the exhibition that's upstairs, The Art of Video Games, not only are we looking at physical material, but we're also looking at digital material. The physical material is material that I'm very familiar with. Drawings on paper, perhaps folded up maps that relate to video games, and we know very well how to preserve that material. When it comes to video games, we're dealing with hardware, plastics, metals, and in ways we know how to work with that material on its own in isolation. The big challenge, I think, comes in the coding, the software, and how to take care of all of this. So to start off our program today, I'm going to ask our first speaker, David Gibson from the Library of Congress, to give us an overall introduction to his work at the Library of Congress, and he has some slides and visual materials to show us. I'm hoping we might be able to bring the lights down just a little for that presentation.
Sure, so I'll head over to the computer here. So. Good afternoon, everybody.
And David, just for the sake of some members of the audience who might not know about careers in museums,
Sure.
I'm in a museum, but you're at a library, an
Right.
archive. Could you maybe just explain a little bit about how you came to your position?
Yeah, actually, so I work in the moving image section of the Library of Congress. I'm a technician there. And the video games, as of 2006, sort of fall under the umbrella of the Motion Picture Broadcast Recorded Sound Division. That's the division that my section is part of. So my background is actually in moving image preservation, film preservation. I went to UCLA to get my master's in in their moving image preservation program, and then did a little bit of volunteer work for the library in the vaults, the nitrate film vaults in Dayton, which is in Dayton, Ohio, before they were moved to Culpeper, Virginia, where all of our collections are now. And then I was hired by the library to work with this. And it was just so happened that I started working in the library in 2006, and that was the same year that they finally decided that they were going to approach questions related to video games, collecting and preserving video games seriously. So I just happened to, kind of come in at the right time. I was, I had the fortunate, circumstance of being one of the few people in the moving image staff who had actually played a video game. So that was also helpful. Since then I've just worked with, there's sort of a core group of us within the moving image section who are thinking about these issues. It's, it has yet to eclipse, the moving image and audio recording preservation work that goes on in our building, but we're slowly but surely chipping away at, at trying to figure out how video games will fit into what we do. And this will show you a little bit of what we do and give you a little behind the scenes look about of how things work there. So this is the building where I work. It's in Culpeper, Virginia, so it's actually 60 miles south of DC, whereas all the other library buildings are here in DC, just on the other side of the mall over there. We have our own facility. This facility was basically, this was gifted to the federal government by David Packard, who's heir to the Hewlett-Packard fortune. It's the single biggest gift that a private individual has given to the federal government. And he basically gave it to us because he's a big fan of old movies, and he wanted to have a place, an actual national center that would deal with audiovisual conservation. So they built this one for us, and then UCLA is building basically a mirror version of this building in Santa Clarita, California. So there'll be one on each coast. That's currently in the works, I think, in Santa Clarita. So, we have in this building 1.2 million items of moving image collection, 3 million items of recorded sound, over 2 million documents related to moving image and recorded sound, and 4,000 video games. So that kind of puts it into perspective in terms of how new this collection is for us. And that's basically what it looks like when they come in. I don't want to mislead you. This is actually, all of our collections come in this way. It's not just video games getting the proverbial shaft. All of our video collections come in these mailers from Copyright. Almost all of what we have so far from the video game collection are items that have come in through the copyright process. The bulk of the collection, or half of the collection, is older games that were actually retained and kept by the main reading room in the Jefferson Building. And they were games, mainly educational games, and games that included some sort of graphic, violent, or sexual content that might raise a red flag and might be an issue for a congressional matter or something like that. So they had to have the games on hand so they would be able to reference them if some constituency had a problem with something. So that's the first 2,000 games that we got, and we actually brought those over from the main reading room and brought them into our custody in the movie image section. At that same time, copyright law was changed slightly so that we actually could ensure that we started to receive actual games. Before that, copyright law only requested a videotape of the game being played, about 10 minutes or so of the game being played, or a DVD, and the first 25 and last 25 pages of source code for the game printed out on a piece of paper. On several pieces of paper, I should say. So this is basically, as they come in, it goes from this, essentially. These are some of the older games that we received, including the InSync Fantasy Phone and CD-ROM game. That's one of my favorites. And let's see, we have some Star Wars games there. These are some of the newer games that we've been receiving. So we mainly receive, I mean, as you would expect, it's basically console games, newer console games that we've been receiving from copyright in the last few years. And so being archivists, our first inclination is to take all those colorful, pretty games and to put them into cream-colored boxes. But this is as much of an organization issue as it is a storage issue. One of the first concerns of our curators was, like, well, we want these games, but we don't really want them to take up too much valuable, film and video space. So our first decision was to sort of collapse the boxes of the older games that we were getting, which were mainly in cardboard boxes, collapse those down and put them into folders. And so, along with all of the other material that came with those games, as you'll see in the next slide. Oh, this is an example of one of the boxes here. So I think we generally fit about 8 games per box, so that the real estate on the shelf is a little bit less than it would be. And here is an example of one of the games and all of the accompanying material that comes with it. This is Fallout 2. And so here you'll see the box, which is sort of the big center thing there. The game itself, which is here in this jewel case. You have the journal that came with the game, where you can kind of keep notes of how you were playing. And then lots of advertisements that came with the game. So these are things that, since we're not really providing any real access to the game as of yet, and we haven't figured out honestly how we're going to approach that yet. Our biggest concern right now is just making sure that all of these accompanying materials and anything else related to a game that we might get is kept together, so that we have some context to give the game. So if a researcher does come in and say, well, I want to know everything you have for Fallout 2, we're able to give them all of these items and possibly any other things we might receive, strategy guides or something like that for Fallout 2, so they at least have some understanding of the context of the game and what it meant to play it and how to play it, beyond actually having the ability to play it, which we're not able to provide yet. Here's just another example. This is Crusaders of the Dark Savant. So we do have some games, some floppy games, not a lot. Most of the games that we, probably the oldest game we have in our collection currently from copyright is from 1990, and so it's mainly CD-ROMs. There's a few floppy games that come through. And these are examples. We still do receive DVDs of gameplay. Every once in a while, someone didn't get the memo that they're supposed to send us the actual game. So they'll send us descriptive material and then these DVDs of gameplay. And here's just a screen grab of one of those DVDs. Looks like this is actually a DS game, Clubhouse Games. And this is actually the Japanese version. We received a DVD of the gameplay for the Japanese version of that particular game. These actually are some of the more esoteric games in our collection. These are CDIs, which were playable on Philips' proprietary gaming system around the mid-90s. And these are things, I think all of these are actually Europe. They were published in Europe. And these came from just an individual. We actually didn't get these through copyright, but these are, so these are some of the rarer things we have in our collection now. And then again, these are just examples of some of the games we receive from the actual Japanese version, which is exciting and interesting. And I'm still not entirely sure why those are being sent in for U.S. copyright law, but I'm glad that they are, because in some cases we'll get a game that otherwise is only available in America for download, and those games we actually are not. There's nothing in place yet for us to capture those born digital games that never actually are published and sold in stores. So to get anything like that is a move in the right direction, I think. That's something that we are still struggling with, is how we are going to approach these games that are born digital and never made physical, because it's something that for copyright especially, I mean, the Copyright Office just hasn't set anything up yet for us to receive born digital submissions. We're going to be starting to receive born digital submissions for moving image material soon through a project with Disney and MTV. We're going to be getting some TV shows from them, born digital, but the gaming, we haven't started to talk about that yet. Another detail of that game. And then we do get, other documentation. This is from the game Diner Dash. And again, they sent us in a DVD of gameplay, but they also sent us in a bunch of just printed out screen captures of the game. So this is something else that we, are happy to have. It's something that we can then put in the archive and hope to keep around, in lieu of actually providing access to the game itself, or in addition to, hopefully at some point. And this is an example of some of the source code we receive. I actually purposefully made it look like the scroll at the beginning of Star Wars, since it's a Star Wars game. It's the Force Unleashed 2. So, and again, I mean, when we get source code, we're only getting a very small excerpt of the source code. So it really doesn't do us much good beyond, just getting it. We aren't really able to use it for preservation purposes later on down the line, and that's something else that we're talking about and thinking about now, of how we can go about, getting all of the source code, hopefully. This is your typical library cart full of books until you see this detail and see that they're actually all strategy guides for various games. So we do get strategy guides through copyright, and those are all being sent to Culpeper now to our building. These are slightly older, so they were subject to the library's beloved binding and collections care. We've now asked that they no longer bind them this way, because it in some ways destroys they have to strip the spine off the book basically to bind it. So we all the ones that we receive now are just the standard paperback strategy guides. So we're keeping those. I think the idea is that we will hopefully have the strategy guide with the game for which it exists, like shelved together with that, so that we can add that to our sort of contextual grouping. Okay, so this is a screen capture of you can actually go to Copyright's website, and they have a database of everything that's been sent in for copyright. And so I looked up Pac-Man just out of curiosity. And so this was sent in. It looks like it was sent in 1982. You'll see the application title there is Puck-Man, not Pac-Man. And when you see the description, it says a video cassette, 20 minutes VHS video cassette. So, that was, again, since they couldn't send us the entire arcade game of Pac-Man, they just sent us in a video cassette. I have no idea where this video cassette is. That's something else that we're currently working on, is trying to figure out, because we know that there have been things that have come in that could be of value, but since video games weren't really a priority until very recently, and that's typically how the library works. I mean, they are kind of slow to certain things like that. I mean, we're doing the same thing with television now, where we're only now going back and getting a lot of the very early television programs, because the library just didn't see television as a viable medium worthy of preservation or collecting at the time. So we only just recently got a full run of I Love Lucy, like last year. So we were like, oh, this is so exciting, we finally have I Love Lucy in the library. But that should have been there decades ago. And then I looked up Super Mario Brothers 2, and again, identifying material deposited in lieu of video game, which probably just means that they sent in a piece of paper that says Super Mario Brothers is a game in which a plumber jumps on turtles or whatever, But there's some interesting things to be found in these copyright records. First of all, you'll see that the application title for this game is Mario's Adventure, which obviously changed later on. You can see the date that it was registered, date of publication, which is September 14th, 1985. I know that date has been much debated as far as when exactly Super Mario Brothers came out. And again, this is something else. Whatever material was sent in is, again, something that we don't exactly know where it is. It's probably in a warehouse somewhere, being overseen by top men. And here's when I get to use my Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's typical. So it's being pushed. I mean, and it's very likely that it is in a warehouse somewhere. Most likely in Landover, Maryland. So again, that's going to be something that we will want to pursue, is trying to find out, just how to go back. Even we're basically 90% sure that there aren't any games there. That's mainly just the videotapes and the scripted material. But it's still something I think that's worth having, just for a historical record. I mean, we have tons of, since I mainly work with moving images, we have tons of copyright descriptions of silent films that no one has seen, for 100 years, and but at least we have a description that it once existed, and this is the plot synopsis, or something that gives researchers, some value, some contextual value. If they can't see that film, at least they can read what it's about or who was in it. It's the same thing with the paper prints. I mean, the paper print collection at the library is basically, if you don't know, it's silent films that, since they didn't want to send in the dangerous, highly flammable nitrate film during the silent era, they would just print an entire film on a sheet of, like a roll of contact paper and send that in. And we have those now, and we're starting to digitize those now so we can put them back onto film. But it's because they sent in those pieces of paper that we're able to, to preserve things now that, that haven't been seen for 100 years and only exist because they were on paper. So, I mean, there's something to be said for that kind of contextual information, or those things that are sent in lieu of the actual item. I'm going to skip that because I think we're going to have questions later, but I'm going to leave this up for a little while in case anyone has questions or donation ideas. Hint, hint. We're currently still, relying on copyright to build our collection, and the library isn't great about getting the word out about these things, except for when I come to events like this. So we're definitely hoping to, talk to people about getting more discrete collections of basically any related material. It doesn't have to be games. It could be, if you have boxes of Nintendo Power sitting at your house or something that you just are looking for a home for, please contact us. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Oh, yeah.
That was a really great introduction to big concepts that are part of all of our sort of jobs. And that is the concepts of criteria for collecting what we decide we want to collect, whether it's in a museum, at the Library of Congress, or anywhere. And I actually have one quick question for you, and that is, if people are sending in lots of things, and that happens at a lot of institutions, where we receive things, and if we feel there's a place for it, that's great. But if there's not, or if you have a certain number of duplicates, what happens?
Well, right now we're just sort of operating under the keep everything policy because we can. I mean, that's one unique thing about the library, is that we do have sort of lots of, or like, we like to think that we have like an infinite amount of space, although we don't really. But I mean, we do have duplicates of certain things, and we're just going to go ahead and keep them for now because we can, essentially. I mean, I realize that's not something that every institution is able to say, but it is something that we are in the fortunate position of being able to say. As we go through and sort of try to figure out like what we might want to weed, I mean, I don't think video games are first up on the guillotine for that kind of thing. I mean, we have other things that are sort of that we have duplicates of that we will probably like older video collections and things like that. So. That we're currently digitizing. So yeah, but right now I think we're just in such a, we're in such a need of having a foundation upon which to build the game collection, and also, leverage to say to, the higher ups in the library that this is something important and something worthy of preservation and worthy of collecting. That at this point we're just collecting it or keeping everything.
Mm-hmm. And in the process of collecting art or video games, what we find we have to do is document everything we can. And sometimes that involves taking pictures of the material. It involves writing reports, starting files with the material you showed us, the copyright forms. Mm-hmm. And it also involves deciding how to store it. And I was very impressed with your boxes, those archival boxes. And not only were we concerned with sort of physically how we're housing these materials, and it's all of the materials associated with video games, but also their climate. We're very careful to monitor sort of humidity, because you can imagine with anything that involves composite materials like plastics with other materials. If things get too hot, plastic can stick to paper, and then over time you might have a hard time opening something up. Also, temperature is something we have to spend a lot of time thinking about and monitoring. And so the facilities where we're storing these materials are very expensive facilities to run, but we take the storage of all these materials very seriously. Now, at the Library of Congress, right now there's no public access of the video material. So I wanted to segue over to Rachel Donahue, who's working on a PhD, and ask Rachel if you could sort of tell the audience a little about your work in academia now, and as you do research, how you access material related to video games, like where you go and what you get to look at.
Okay, so first I should say that I wear sort of two hats. On one side, I work for the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, which is a digital humanities center on campus. And with that hat, I look at actual games themselves, and we're researching sort of best practices for preserving those games. Not necessarily so much the hardware, but taking a copy of the game on a computer, can you emulate it? Can you use original hardware with a computer? Things of that nature. For my personal research, I look not at the games, but at the records of game development. So things like the concept art, the game design documents, storyboards, post-it notes, budgets, anything business or creative that's related to the development of those games. And as you might imagine, most game companies most corporations in general don't open their archives or museums or any of that to the public, assuming that they even have them, which many of them don't. But we are fortunate enough in the United States, we have I'm going to go 4.5 institutions that collect these materials officially, and they have existing relationships with developers that make it so that they can acquire these materials and open them up for research use. So one of them is the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. You'll be hearing from JP Dyson from there later this afternoon. It's an awesome museum. Everybody should go see it, really. And so they have a lot of development records. So I spent some time looking at the materials there on Ralph Baer, who is often considered the father of video games. He developed the first patent that led to the Magnavox Odyssey. And they have half of those records, and half of those records are actually just down the street at the American History Museum as well. So with those, I could look at those records. Also, the University of Texas has a video game history archive. Stanford collects games and sort of software history materials. And then there's the Computer History Museum as well, which has fewer game materials, but they do have a lot of examples of hardware and software and records like that. So it can be very difficult because even where there are institutions collecting it, even some of the records at the Strong, while they have them and they preserve them so that we know that they will be there, sometimes they're preserved under the condition that nobody can use them.
And Rachel, could you tell us a little about what your PhD will address?
My intention with my PhD is to address the management of that sort of collection, so everything from acquisition through providing access to the materials.
And right now, for example, hypothetically, if you were about to make a trip to the Strong or elsewhere, do you find that you're able to access a lot online? So when you actually show up at the institution, there's someone who can sort of pull records for you and you spend days just sort of pouring through them? Because I know with traditional art, if we're doing research, I will make an appointment and have, just page through files where nothing's organized, but that's sort of what makes it fun for me, actually, because occasionally you feel like you're making a discovery and reading a letter someone wrote to someone else about the creation of the art, the video game.
Well, I would say two things there. One is that archival description is very high level. So yes, there might be a finding aid available saying we have this collection, it contains this sort of material, but it's not at the detail level. And it's the same thing. I make an appointment, I go there, I look through the boxes, and just because of the nature of my research, I'm not looking for anything specific, I'm looking at everything. I want to see every kind of record that goes into the development of a video game.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to move on to my colleague Michael Mansfield. Michael and I work together at American Art. And Michael was instrumental in installing our show upstairs, The Art of Video Games. So what I'd like for us to talk about now is, in a way, making the video game material accessible in this context in an exhibition setting. And so there are a lot of considerations that go into that. And I'm hoping, Michael, you could tell us all about, I know Georgina touched upon the choice of what videos went into it, maybe the process there in brief, and then talking about sort of design, layout, and whatever you can think of.
Sure. I'm Michael Mansfield. I work on the Film and Media Arts collection here and all of our various initiatives, one of which was the development of this exhibition. We've been talking a lot about the code and the development of the game mechanics and what exists on, say, those CDs and sort of in text. But one of our primary focuses here for this exhibition was the hardware that is required to really to experience those games. We spent an enormous amount of, this exhibition covers 40 years of video game history, and during those 40 years, there has been an enormous amount of change and technological development, largely pushed by the game designers and the engineers themselves, and then the coders who are trying to find ways of really pushing the limits of the video game within the hardware, and then the hardware engineers are trying to push the limits within the coders or open things up for them. So the code that exists for Pac-Man was one of the most difficult ones, difficult games we installed, mostly because we used the original Pac-Man board, and we had to integrate it into a contemporary computer so we can control the power for the board turning on and turning off. But that requires a number of other steps that we had to overcome, which was finding a way to integrate that board with the video projector, because the original Pac-Man board puts video out at a very, very low resolution. And if you know anything about video resolution now, we have high-def televisions that are 9 times what they were in 1970-something. So finding ways to bring that code to life in this exhibition was a real challenge for us. And I think that we had to make some compromises, obviously, with projecting a lot of the video games rather than putting them on CRTs. I know there are a lot of purists out there that really respond to this. I myself was one of them. I really wanted to put the games on CRTs. That's how you originally experienced them. The response time was quite a bit different with an original RGB TV. But in order to ensure that this exhibition would last over the course of 5 years, because it is traveling, as a design challenge, we wanted to place people inside video games. We decided to project them. So we made a compromise between using some of the original hardware but not using all of it.
I'd like to actually, with the Pac-Man, I started playing Pac-Man on a computer, so that's how I learned it. And when I went into the show and started to play with the sort of stick up there, I remember thinking, man, it's not going fast enough, and I really had to adjust my timing. Can you just talk about all the handheld devices that you chose for upstairs? Yeah,
we did use all of the original hardware for all 5 playable games. So we used the original Pac-Man and a controller. But for the latest game that we exhibit, we were using a PS3 and the PS3 controller. And there are the controller, actually the evolution of the controllers, it's sort of a subtext for the exhibition. The way you interact with games, the way you sort of jump into that performance space is different now than it was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. The PS3 controller is motion sensitive, but it's connected with a cord so we can charge it, and that cord keeps coming undone. I don't know if you've experienced that when you're up there, but when the cord comes undone, the game freezes and it really kind of ruins the experience for everybody. We've managed to overcome most of that, but that was one of the many challenges we've had.
I think you guys did a great job, because basically in the middle of the exhibition there's a room where you can play 5 different games, and we had a lot of discussion before the exhibition about how you can design that space so that people can play a game, have an individual experience, and hear noise. And we all thought, oh my gosh, how is this going to work if we have competing noises from 5 games? It's just going to be a disaster. But in the end, it worked out really well. I don't know if you can maybe comment on the design aspects.
We did have one of the most important tracks through the exhibition for us was the inclusion of the player. That the gamer was just as much a part of the game as the game designer and the game itself, that they fulfilled a contract for that creative experience. And we worked very hard to be able to place the gamer at the center of these playable games, that their manipulation of the mechanics is what really brings it to life. And the audio, the sonic experience of playing a game is one of the things that helps sort of write that for you. So if you go through the exhibition, you'll see the pods that we developed that sort of surround you in the game, and we use directional sound so that you can hear the sound from the left and the right. You're really sort of in the middle of it. It was a happy accident in a way that when you're inside that space, it sounds kind of like an arcade, but you really aren't. It's not such a conflagration of.
I was going to say that if you don't hear at least 5 games in an arcade, I mean, that's it should give you at least a feeling of
exactly
being in an arcade.
That was a really happy accident, but one that worked out well for us.
And in the last room of the exhibition, could you maybe, for those who haven't been up, just mention, sort of describe how the installation works in terms of time period, showing hardware?
Right. One of the great curatorial problems that the Library of Congress does not have to deal with is choosing what is important to preserve. I wish we had the luxury of just preserving everything. We were able to put these video games up for a vote and let the public decide what we were going to exhibit. Our curator, Chris Melissinos, who you'll hear from later, created a list that included some really important games, and we put it out for the public to sort of respond to. They gave us, he organized it in, after we received all the games back, we organized it into various eras that represent, there are 5 eras of video games, from the earliest games to the most contemporary games, which end with the PlayStation 3. I know I might get yelled at for that, but we know that over 5 years that's going to change. There's going to be an era 6, which we won't include in the exhibit. But so we took a number of consoles from each era. We took the 4 winning games from each console. We captured some gameplay, and we did a bunch of research and wrote about the game design experience and the gameplay experience and its cultural impact, and sort of tried to present that in a really it's a bit abbreviated because it's only a minute long, and most gameplay is like 16 hours or something. But you can select one game from each console or all 4, and there are 80 games in all. So if you have some time, you can go through 80 games of narration. So
at this point, I just want to mention that I recently read an article in an academic journal that Dave sent me, and it was about the Learning Games Initiative Research Archive. And the Learning Games Initiative maintains one of the largest working archives of computer game hardware, software, and related materials in the Americas. And what I found really fascinating about this article was a discussion about cultural memory and how in the world of video games, it's so important for people to experience them. As you were highlighting just a few minutes ago, the gamer is a part of this whole experience, is a part of the creative process of the art, if you will. And in this article, they were arguing that instead of preserving things in the way I'm used to preserving things, which is to sort of lock them away, put things in a box, in a perfect climate, don't touch it, they were arguing that use as preservation is key. And they were saying that you have to privilege preservation through use over storage or exhibition. And one reason they're saying this is because not only are people experiencing things and remembering it and maybe being able to talk about it, but as games might break, maybe you'll have some problem with hardware. You have to learn how to fix it, and you remember how to do it. And Michael and I work together in our museum to work with all of the digital media art we have, whether it's the TV screens, the LED lights. And as things break down, and this is artwork that's been produced, it's not something you buy off the shelf. Art is a creative process, and bits and pieces of different electronics may have been formed together just for a unique piece. And as things break, we have to work as a team and sometimes bring in what we call an integrator or an electrical engineer to help us figure out how to put the piece back together. And often that's not something you can learn out of a book. You have to learn it from experience. So I thought this argument was really interesting, and it sort of challenges the way we work in museums, I think in the Library of Congress. And I wanted to ask if each of you guys could sort of argue for or against. If you have one video game and all of its material, do you leave it in the box and never open it, or is use
The way to go. Open it, actually. If you
Okay.
have a shrink-wrapped game, take the shrink wrap off.
That's rule number one.
Yes, because the shrink, it gives off gases and it can damage the game or like bond to the box. It's terrible. Don't leave your games in shrink wrap. I know that they're worth more money that way, but it's bad for them.
Well, I mean, I will say, we are putting the games in boxes. We are doing what archives do, and putting them away. I don't think that the ultimate goal is to leave them in there, and I certainly don't think the ultimate goal is to not, try to do some sort of preservation for access purposes. I mean, that's just as a building. That's kind of why we were built. I mean, if that wasn't, certainly when David Packard gave the federal government the money and built us this beautiful movie theater that's also in our building. I mean, the whole idea was, well, you'll preserve these films and you'll preserve this audio, but it's so that people will be able to come and watch them. And so, the National Jukebox project that exists now, where you can hear digitized recordings, old, wax cylinders that have been digitized, and you can listen to them online. I mean, I think that is the mission of our building. Right now, it's just sort of raising games to the level of moving image and recorded sound. I mean, it's, again, it's only been 6 years since we started working with these materials, but now I think we've reached a point in our own history and our history as I'm 35 now. I've been playing. I can't remember a time when I wasn't playing video games or I didn't have a home video game system. And I mean, I think that's just going to be how it's going to be from now on. It's an important part of people's lives. So I mean, I don't think the window should be as long as it was for certain other, works of art or works of media before people start to understand the importance of preserving these things and providing access to them. Preserving them for access. Again, it's just more at this point logistics and bureaucracy keeping us from providing access. But I think the idea is we're hoarding it all so that at some future date, we will be able to use all of these things and send them out and provide access for them.
I think that it's really, almost to play devil's advocate, I think that I really want to put the work out in front of people now, but at the same time, the hardware that we use to experience these things has a really limited lifespan. We deal with this, as Tiarna was saying, with our collection upstairs. We have a number of artworks that were designed to play on a CRT television screen, a cathode ray tube television. And those televisions, when they were originally built, they have a 20 to 30,000 hour life if it's a commercial, sort of a consumer grade screen. So commercial grade screens last a little bit longer, but if we, if everyone in America plays a video game on a CRT screen for a short amount of time, eventually that screen is going to die. And if you're following the industry now, CRT screens are no longer available. They're not made. It's not going to be something that's easily reproduced in the future because the process for creating those cathode ray tube televisions is once they shut the plant down, they can't start it back up again. So we have as many CRTs as we're likely going to have. There are a few still being made, but so original RGB television screens that you would play Super Mario on, that part of the experience is gone. Mm-hmm. That doesn't take away from the code, but it definitely takes away from the playable game.
Right, and it gets into questions of exactly what are you trying to preserve? I mean, these are all questions asked by different, lots of different media. I mean, are you trying to preserve the experience? Are you just trying to preserve the content? I mean, if we show a silent film in our theater and Packard campus, I mean, it's not going to look or feel, I mean, like it did in 1917 or whatever. I mean, it's just the projector bulb is gonna be a lot brighter than the projector bulb was back then, or the screen's gonna be a lot wider, and I mean, the resolution's probably gonna be obviously a lot higher in terms of all the detail you're gonna be seeing. Hopefully it will be projected at the right frame rate so it doesn't look like it's moving really fast, because that's the misconception that silent films didn't actually move that fast. They were actually moving at regular speed. People project them more quickly. But I mean, yeah, I think those are questions that we should all be asking as people who are interested in preserving games. It's I mean, as the hardware starts to be harder and harder to keep up, I mean, and that part of the experience gets harder and harder to replicate, then, I mean, what do you what do you actually want to
This is
preserve?
actually one of the questions that we've been trying to address with the Preserving Virtual Worlds project. You know, what is sort of good enough when it comes to preservation? I will be honest, I used to fervently believe that the hardware didn't matter. You just needed to save the game, and if you could get a really accurate emulation, that was great, and you were fine. And then we started doing this research into what is really significant about the game, what makes this game this particular game. And one of the games that we looked at was Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door, if anyone has played that. And that's when I began to realize that a lot of times sort of the difficulty and challenge in a game is moderated by the placement of buttons on the controller. And if you take that away and you let somebody map the keys to whatever keys they want on a keyboard, then, suddenly to become a paper airplane, they're not having to like do this, they're just like this. And I feel that dramatically changes gameplay. And to the question of, do we preserve for use or just kind of preserve for here is the artifact? I think that you absolutely have to preserve for use. If you don't preserve a game in order to allow it to be played, it's like instead of preserving a film, you're just preserving the stills. And there's value in that. You get a flavor of the movie from the stills, and you get a flavor of a game from videos of gameplay, but it's not the same thing at all.
And Rachel, I think you probably have more experience considering emulators in your research. Could you maybe speak to that topic? It's a huge one, I know, and we're basically touching on it now. So I think we're headed that way.
It is a big one. So I'll talk about some work that I was doing this week, working with Super Nintendo games, and so we talked about the degrading of the hardware and also the necessity of the hardware to play the game. And this is where the really avid collecting community comes in, because you have all of these people that grew up blowing in their Nintendo cartridges to make them work, and they became engineers. And so they learned things like, oh, well, I can replace the 72-pin connector in this Nintendo. Or, oh, wouldn't it be great if instead of having to worry about all of the legal issues with playing with game ROMs, we could just play the original cartridge on our computer? And this student in Germany actually developed something called the Retro 2 that allows you to play Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games in an emulator on your computer using the original controllers. So you find a lot of things like this which sort of give you a happy medium where if the hardware necessary to play the game degrades, but the media is still all right, then you can use that media. And it does also have the side benefit of you can take an image of both the game itself and any save games that are on the cartridge using the Retrode. So that's one thing that's like sort of the best emulation in my opinion. And then the second best would be to take those pure software emulations where you just have the software system and you're plugging in an image of the game and playing it on the computer. There are also cases of either converters for classic game controllers to USB or recreations of the game controllers with USB cords, and I think that's probably where we're going to end up being when it comes to, allowing people to play the Atari 2600 in 20 years.
Dave, could you share the detail you shared with us this morning about, I think it was the game on the floppy disk,
Oh, right.
which I would have given up all hope on if I saw
Right,
it.
right, yeah. Well, I was just telling, we had a roundtable discussion earlier today, and we were talking about some of these issues, and I was sharing the story, and this happened, I think, only like last week, maybe the week before, but we have a game, Rise of the Dragon, in our collection from 1990, all the way back in 1990, and it's a game on 3.5-inch floppy disks. Luckily, I work in a place that's so antiquated that we still have 3.5-inch floppy drives on our computers at work. And so I just I honestly thought nothing would happen. So I popped the first disc of Rise of the Dragon in to my computer, and next thing I know, the music is playing, the credits are rolling, the drug deal's going down, which I think is the first thing that happens in that game, and all of its 16-bit glory. And I was just really excited that I was actually, because here I thought, just because I think I just sort of assume that, if I put this thing in, it's not going to work, even though it's clearly designed to work in this kind of drive. I think there's just this, and it's probably just I'm just being brainwashed by people who, scare me about, the the short lifespan of digital media or whatever. But so I was just so excited that I was actually able to put that in, so that we technically could provide access to that game, and probably most of the CD-ROM games that we retrieved from the main reading room. So that gave me encouragement. I mean, that the idea or the fact that we can indeed provide access at least to those games right now is encouraging. We have not yet procured any other hardware for the console games we're receiving through copyright. I've tried a couple of times, but I think when it comes to crunch time and budget time, it just sort of falls to a little lower on the list of things to buy. But I mean, it's certainly something that we will continue to look for, so that because it is still my hope that in the same way that we have a flatbed viewing room in our reading room here on Capitol Hill in the Madison Building for 35 millimeter film viewing and for video viewing, that we will have an analogous station where people will be able to at least have reading room access to our games. Mm-hmm. But again, it's something that it's a matter of convincing the powers that be.
I think in looking for the traditional hardware, you'll look to the community. And
yes.
I've been blown away just learning about the community of gamers out there. And I would love to hear from each of you about sort of what you have learned or benefited from in discussions, perhaps like on listservs like the International Games Development Association, specifically about preserving video games, but maybe other things. Because I know in a lot of professional organizations now, these listservs are incredibly important. They're such a great way to communicate, to ask questions of the community. So I don't know, maybe Michael, you could start in relation to the exhibition.
Sure. One of the things I was really impressed with when we started developing the design of the exhibition was the fact that gamers were really rallying around this in a sort of grassroots efforts, because again, it wasn't being done by game companies. They weren't concerned about stuff that they weren't currently selling. But gamers who played a game 20 years ago and were really profoundly touched by that game were interested in making sure that it had a life beyond the console. And I think we looked to quite a few of them. We signed up for all these listservs. I get 100 emails a day from listservs about preserving one game or another, or how to blow in the cartridge properly in order to get it connect to the machine. And that's a really valuable tool, especially in terms of conservation. We have for some of the other artworks that we have. You mentioned earlier the Variable Media Network. There are databases being developed about what materials and mediums artists have used or how they manipulated materials in order to get to a desired effect. And having an access point to that information is really important. So seeing game developers develop these listservs like this, it's certainly a product of our age. We have the internet, which 40 years ago we didn't have. But this is a great resource for us in terms of institutionalizing games, which is not a term I would like to use for games.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe Rachel, in doing your research and your thinking, how has listservs or the community at large been useful to your work?
So one of the things I guess I would say is when you look at more traditional media like film and photography, and you take a look at the professionally published literature, there are a lot of guides to how to deal with preserving nitrate film. Right. What type of standards should you have when you're doing digital images and things like that. And we don't have those for video games. There are no guides to conserving and preserving video games really in the professional literature. But what you do have is a community who is really avid about preserving their own collections. They're probably better at preserving their collections than most archives and museums are. So you have things like a couple of chemists who are like, man, my Commodore 64 is disgusting. How can I bring it back to its former glory? It looks yellow. I didn't do anything. It's just that the air oxidizes the plastic and makes it look awful. And so they actually came up with a formula for mixing oxygel for laundry and 10 to 15% hydrogen peroxide and covering it and putting it under a UV light for a couple of hours, and it actually takes care of a lot of the yellowing. And so you can go online and you have a step-by-step guide, just like you might find in a preservation manual for any other traditional media telling you how to do this. You have step-by-step guides telling you how to replace failing parts of hardwares. There's a database for NES cartridges which goes down to detailing every individual chip that is on every individual PC board inside every cartridge. And so these are just tremendous resources for anybody trying to do preservation. The other great example that I would like to give is we have at MIF, I don't know, something like 50 Mac Classics, and probably 4 of them worked. And through a little bit of research, I learned that this is due to leakage from the capacitors onto the logic board, and that the best way to fix this in a short-term measure other than replacing capacitors is to put it in the dishwasher. And I did. I put it in the dishwasher, and it worked. And we can boot that machine now. So,
Excellent.
Invaluable.
Well, I will say that it wasn't until I listed our information on the IGDA directory that, these sorts of opportunities to come and speak at these kinds of things were even offered up. So that was one helpful thing. Like I said before, we just haven't, quite put ourselves out there. I think mainly because we're still in such early stages of doing what we're doing, and the library, sort of moves slowly about these kinds of things. But I do think, engaging with, the actual gaming and collecting community is the most important thing you can do. In the same way that engaging with film collectors was what allowed so many film archives to be built up the way it was. One of the things that was actually very successful in terms of sort of engaging with gamers, we actually had a screening in our theater at the Packard campus of Tron, and I got to introduce it. I asked if I could please introduce it, mainly because I wanted to put the question to the audience, or put forth the request to the audience before the movie started to please, if they had anything they would like to donate to us, and I knew that would be a good audience to ask, and I knew they would be sort of captive and they would be into video games, because why else would you watch Tron?
Did you let them leave without signing away?
No, in fact, and then I spoke to 3 people afterwards, and we actually did get a few. We have about like 8 Atari cartridges from one woman who lives in Culpeper County, and a few other, just small collections of things that we wouldn't have otherwise, had that screening not happen, and had I not put out that request. So I think that's something just like all public institutions need to be, better about. It's just kind of like reaching out to that particular segment of the community.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very important. At this point, I'd like to ask if any of you have questions, comments. I know we do have some microphones standing up the edges. If you want to get up and walk to a microphone, you can. Otherwise, I'll do my best to maybe repeat your question. I see a hand in the middle.
Can you just talk a little bit about how, you said how preserving the hardware is also as important as preserving the content, but in terms of if you are able to take Super Mario Brothers game and put it into a ROM on a computer and fully preserve that content and display it to the end user as it would have been seen, on a CRT display and whatnot, is that good enough for one part of the preservation, and then the other part of the preservation being preserving the hardware so that way it can be used in its entirety?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear, the question was about preserving the hardware and the software simultaneously, and whether the hardware is just as important. I think that this is a critical question. We as an art museum, we are really focused primarily on presenting the work in its original form to the audience, so they're free to make associations for themselves. And that would be an exhibition format. But an access format, being able to preserve it for people for historical purposes or scholarship, or some, in order to just to provide a glimpse of what the game was. There are different reasons, I guess, for looking at video games. Upstairs, we wanted to present the art of video games, which meant looking at the hardware, the envelope of electronics, and the gameplay, and the game mechanics, and the gamers. So we wanted to try to look at all of those things. But I know that Rachel has talked to a lot of designers who have maybe a different opinion that preserving the access should be privileged over preserving the hardware.
Yeah, we have a saying in archives. It's a core part of sort of the archives profession called "it depends." Like Michael was alluding to, it really depends on your audience. Who are you preserving this for? If I am preserving something, say, for use by a typical game scholar or game historian, then to me, preserving the software as well as the interface mechanism, so the controller, is good enough. Although I know somebody who will say to his dying breath that being able to hear the spinning of the disc is crucial to how you experience the game. I think that you can just document how people felt about that. You don't have to actually have, the 5 1/4 drive there. But let's say that instead I have an electrical engineering school and I'm a university archives that supports this electrical engineering school. In that case, preserving the actual hardware is going to become very important. Yeah, I mean, it just really depends on what your mission is and who you're serving.
Right, and for us, I mean, emulation is kind of a slippery slope, and there's a lot of, questions about legality, and especially being that the Copyright Office is part of the Library of Congress, and so we don't want to, do anything that would, endanger any sort of copyright issue. I mean, for us to provide access, that's kind of the other big hurdle, is that in order for us to provide access, we have to do it sort of, in the most legal and authentic way possible. So it's like hardware for us is very important in order to, if we do want to provide any kind of access, because we can't really approach any emulation without sort of being under fire from copyright. So.
Yeah, I just have to say, I think it's so funny that you get most of your materials because of copyright, so it's really sort of a boon to you, whereas I find that copyright is my biggest barrier.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're both, yeah, they can be both a boon and a barrier for us too.
In the front row?
I have two questions here. Say you have a console that has like hardwired stuff inside it, like hardwired controllers like a television or Famicom. I mean, how do you preserve stuff like that once it breaks? Because I've had to go through two televisions to get a working one, because the controls were hardwired and they couldn't work properly. Mm-hmm. So how do you get around that barrier, especially if you're like technologically challenged like I am? I can't build anything without having it explode. So
exploding is bad.
Yeah, you don't
it can be
want
exciting.
to explode. You don't want that side effect.
No.
So how do you make that work?
We actually deal with this quite a lot with a lot of the artworks that we have here, where the hardware begins to break down, and we've had to engage electrical engineers and integrators to help us fix that. No particular set of skills will ensure that everything is going to work. You always have to fight. You have to identify what the problem is first. The fact that you can tell that something inside the box is broken is the first step. And the second step would be able to figure out what it is that's broken inside the box, and then find the right person to fix that. We regularly engage. We have a great TV guy, a guy who is focused primarily on CRTs. He probably wouldn't claim to be an art expert at all, but we would not be able to present any of the artworks in our collection on television sets without this man and his little company. So finding the right individual to help you correct something is really where we start.
Well, I mean, where can I look? I mean, I don't have the money or resources, obviously, that you guys have. And I'm just 15 years old, and I can barely collect the stuff that the money I scrape together for allowances. So I don't even know where to look, because most people don't repair really obscure old consoles like television.
Do you live in DC?
No, I live in Houston.
You live in Houston. So what I'm going to tell you, Houston is a pretty big city. They probably have it. In DC, we have an organization called Hack DC, which exists to help local hobbyists within the community work together on their projects. So you might have an artist that has a great vision, and then there's also an electrical engineer that works there, and they can work together to make it happen. So I would go back home, get on the internet, and look for your local hackerspace, and you will probably be able to find somebody that can help you with that sort of thing.
What's it called?
A hackerspace?
Hackerspace.
Yeah, because short of learning how to get in there and take it apart and solder parts on, there is nothing you can do other than to keep buying them. Like, I mean, like an Atari 7800, if you want to get those, you have to know how to splice wires, because there is no way that the connector to the back of the machine is connected to the wire that goes into your outlet. It's not going to happen. You need to be able to splice. So I would really look into somewhere where, without a lot of investment of money, you can go and you can acquire these skills. And there are people that would be happy to help you with it, I'm sure.
You know, like engineering class or something?
You wouldn't have to do a class. I mean, in the long term, yes, if that's what you want to do, then you would look at school. But these hacker spaces are full of just enthusiasts who want to help people realize their projects.
Yeah.
All right, and my second question is that y'all go through all the effort of, you know, preserving these games, and I don't have a problem with that, honestly.
Good, I'm glad.
Yeah. But, I don't know if you guys heard of this, but it's a game called Air Raid for the 2600. It's like incredibly rare, went for like $30,000, and there's only like one box copy. It was in mint condition, and the guy who discovered it found it in his garage, like where it's really hot and not well insulated. So if games like that can last in pristine condition for 30 years, how do they survive in average condition? You know, in average conditions like the average basement or attic or wherever you live. Just how do they stay in good condition like that?
Honestly, I just want to say that in part, sometimes there's luck playing a factor. I have a feeling this fellow is very lucky. Sometimes what we say is benign neglect. I hear stories all the time, whether it's video games, videos, a painting by Michelangelo discovered behind a couch. People sometimes forget about things and don't do anything, and they survive, which is, you know, fantastic. Sometimes, if there are bad storage conditions, obviously they'll degrade, fall apart. Often it's accidents that happen. So what we like to encourage people to do is just think about storing things in safe places, you know, in boxes, not in the garage. I'm glad you've picked up on all your guidelines there to stay away from heat and humidity. I'm very impressed. And I have to say, I think you may have a career ahead in being an engineer of video game consoles. Seriously, I mean,
We need more people like that. We definitely need those people. So if you want to pursue it, please do.
As much as I like that, please allow me to refer my previous point. I can't do it.
Oh, yeah, no explosions.
Yeah,
Fair
well,
enough.
but yeah, you just
Well, I
have to
think
keep
the
practicing.
future of conservation here might be in coding, too.
Coding?
There's something we haven't talked about, really, but people who are able to really write poetry with code are going to be just as important as people who are able to touch and fill in paint on
Yeah, I
a
know,
canvas.
but
So.
I hear coding requires a lot of math. I'm not. And in fact, I plan more to pursue design, if anything else. Because I'm not really artistic and I can't really program, so.
Well, just the fact that you're 15 and that you're interested in, you know, rebuilding old consoles is very encouraging for me personally.
Yeah,
You know.
There are people younger than me out there that would love to do this too.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
I'm just a simple case of that.
Right. Well, that's good to know.
Another question. Sorry, I'll take this gentleman in front and then. Yeah.
I didn't hear much about arcade games and their cabinets, because cabinets and their side art and all that is very, there are many collectors out there, many people who believe that those should be preserved as they are and all that. Those take up a lot of space.
Mhm.
So what efforts have you done in preserving those?
I think if you
go
stick around for the second panel, there's somebody that will be here from the Strong Museum of Play who's dealt with arcades, certainly more than I have.
We, our exhibition focused on the introduction of the home console as sort of a starting point. So, and Pac-Man was a bridge from a console, from an arcade cabinet to your living room. But I know that there is indeed a strong community of arcade enthusiasts who are really interested in cabinet, and you know, those cabinets are quite elaborate. And I think that was an important way to experience games. We did an interview with, why can I not remember his name? He's Mr. Bushnell, who was talking about the introduction of the first game machines in bars and how they had ashtrays and cup holders for beers and cigarettes while you were playing a video game. And you know, there's a history there that I think is really worth preserving. We didn't focus on it here for this exhibition, but it's certainly interesting.
Right. And I mean, in our case, I mean, just because, you know, what we receive now is what comes in through copyright, and those, I mean, that doesn't fall into that. But we have the space. I mean, if someone were to say to us, you know, we have this, you know, Galaga cabinet, would you like it? Or, you know, whatever original, you know, Star Wars game or something. I mean, we would not say no. Again, it would also require having somebody on staff that would be able to provide maintenance for it, which, I mean, we don't really right now. I mean, we have people that know how to repair old 2-inch tape machines and 3/4-inch machines. So I would imagine, like, maybe those skills could be transferred. But no, I mean, that's the thing. Is like we would be happy to have those things. I mean, again, like, would they be in our reading room on Capitol Hill? Probably not. I mean, we'd probably drag them out for an exhibition, you know. But otherwise, it would sort of just be in a warehouse somewhere.
I have a question from the lady in the back, maybe? Yeah.
Similar question. It sounds like your efforts to preserve this is an active learning experience. I'm wondering, in what ways has this led your institution to revise its policies about what it acquires, how it preserves it, and what issues were brought up that your institution has led to reflect upon in the long term?
I'd just like to repeat the question, and that is, and paraphrasing, I hope I get it all, that our experience in working with video games has been very much a learning one as we go, and the question is, how has that informed our policies and approaches and procedures in our work?
I mean, for us, it hasn't really, I mean, if anything, we've sort of been applying the old way of doing things to video games. I think that will start to change, because we are going to start receiving, we're just going to be starting to have to deal with digital items a lot more, not just games, but born digital video and audio materials and things like that. So I think actually once that process begins, I think we'll probably be a little bit more comfortable in terms of approaching what we can do with video games. One way it's impacted, I mean, so I said before that we slightly changed the copyright so that we started to receive the actual games themselves in lieu of the 25 or whatever 50 pages of source code and the video tape. We are still attempting to, you know, play with what copyright will let us ask for in terms of what we get for games. So I mean, that's when I said earlier that we'd like to try to maybe get all of the source code if possible. I mean, that's something that, you know, if we have copyright behind us and pushing, you know, for companies to give us those things, then hopefully that can happen. But, you know, again, it's just trying to figure out, you know, how much we can get away with and how much the game companies will be willing to let us get away with, or like how much they'll let us, you know, ask for. So.
I think that for we institutionally, as a part of the Smithsonian Institution, there are a number of art collecting units here, art collecting museums. And together, led by our curator at the National Portrait Gallery, Ann Goodyear, we started a program called the Time-Based Media Arts Working Group. And this was primarily focused on preserving moving image artworks and electronic artworks. It didn't specifically mention video games, but it's focused on all time-based media. And time-based media is just defined as something that changes, like has a changing observable state. We have a great model to work from in collecting and preserving practices around paintings and sculptures. Sculptures in particular have a lot of demands, but recognizing that as sort of a base model, we can now look at moving image artworks and electronic artworks that present a unique set of challenges and sort of come up with ways, protocols, or sort of paper trails and iteration guides and installation guides to sort of document and create some sort of manual for managing them. I think that this exhibition, The Art of Video Games, gave us was really kind of a wake-up call. in terms of preservation for this stuff, because we recognize that the technology has changed so dramatically over the 40 years that each 2 to 3 years there's been some major change in the way video is produced, from analog to digital, or from, you have a VGA pin or BNC cable or RCA cable. All of these things are important to the way the technology is presented, and I think now this certainly opens our eyes to how much work we have to do.
A question from gentleman here.
I noticed with the exhibit, there's a pretty decent expanse, like a console bill. Like the early 90s, I know it was a very competitive time, and in addition to like Sega, I know there's also SNK with Neo Geo AES. Atari released the Jaguar, which failed. And like Neo Geo AES, for example, sold 700,000 to 1.4 million units in the United States. It was the best estimate I last read. What efforts are there to basically like preserve some of the companies that didn't quite make it, or like NEC's TurboGrafx 16?
I think that question is perfect for our second panel, actually, who are focusing on history of culture and gaming. What do you think? Any comments or?
Yeah, I don't. Again, it would just be sort of like trying to gauge from the community. That kind of work I think is being done within the community. Again, the second panel could speak more to this than probably I can, at least.
I think there was a TurboGrafx in the exhibit, wasn't there? I swear I remember seeing
No,
Pong.
I can't remember anymore.
Sorry,
No.
you got to take it.
Oh.
I hope you don't mind. I hope you'll be able to stay. The answer to that one. A question at the back, I think.
Well, I do think, at least in our collection right now, because there was such a focus on educational software, we do have a lot of games that I think are really interesting and really great, and trying to do something different in our collection that I learned about for the first time in dealing with this collection, because they weren't things that were sort of the big bells and whistles games that were marketed. And we actually had, the week that this exhibit opened, we had a visit from Mike Micah, who is a developer at Ocean, and Frank Cafaldi, who is a journalist at Gama Sutra. They came to look at what we had to kind of help us, just give a little bit of perspective on what we might have that's valuable that we didn't even know was valuable, or what what was interesting, and they sort of picked out all kinds of those lesser known games, and they were like, oh, we can't believe you even have this. So that helped us sort of to realize that there was some value beyond the games that you hear about all the time, or the ones that are more well known because they were controversial in some way, which is a big chunk of what we have too. I think that, at least in our work, we're going to just come across those kinds of things anyway, and we're treating each game with the same respect that we would any other game. We're not sort of deciding. There's a culture, I think, and you can see it, for example, again, to go back to a film analogy, there's the film registry where they name the 25 films a year to the 25 important films. But I think what's interesting about that too is that a couple years ago somebody's home movie got named to that list. So I think that you can make a parallel there and say that archives in general don't sort of see everything's sort of not so black and white. There's opportunity to preserve those kinds of interesting things.
It's partly a resource issue too, though. If you're an art museum and you're given the chance to preserve some drawings by Walt Disney or some drawings by me, you're going to pick the Walt Disney. Like, that's just the obvious choice. You know, if you have a choice between something that clearly had a huge impact on society, then unfortunately the little guys are probably going to lose out if your choice is this or that. I think that as time goes on and more people begin to recognize video games as a legitimate art form, as a legitimate, you know, cultural expression, that you will find institutions dedicating themselves maybe to the spectacular failures of the industry, or just trying to find people who did things very different from your AAA titles. But you know, when it comes down to something like an exhibit like this, where you're showing a broad swath of the history, you're going to pick the mega hits.
And I think in a way what Rachel's saying harks back to community and the importance of community and collecting, because collectors all have different interests. And over time, institutions depend on those collectors to introduce us to their holdings and sort of help us understand the importance of whatever genre they collected and the impact it has had on other aspects. So I think, again, I just want to emphasize how important community is to institutional collecting. A question here in the checkered shirt.
Have any thought gone into preserving knowledge dealing with hardware architecture of these games and how to repair it? Myself, I'm an arcade collector, so with these arcade boards and cabinets, it kind of blurs the line between the hardware and the media. So it's really just, you know, all in one. So for these, I know like a lot of stuff in the mid-90s, the board architecture with a suicide mechanism, and so no method of copy protection. So eventually the boards will kill themselves unless you know how to restore it and how to re-engineer the board in such a way that say, it doesn't have a battery or can't get damaged by battery leakage or patchwork or something like that. There's very few people that look into that kind of hardware preservation for these arcade boards, since most of them are proprietary. I kind of have a worry as part of my hobby that eventually this knowledge is going to get rarer and rarer and go away, especially since they're not really manufacturing, just like you mentioned with CRTs, parts that you can use to repair these. You know, every time something breaks, you have to cannibalize another board. The material will go away, the knowledge goes away. So is there anything being done to
Well, yeah, when this goes back to the question that Tiarna asked earlier about about hardware and using hardware to sort of establish some kind of cultural, what was the term that you used?
Like memory.
Cultural memory around that. You know, we exhibit a piece upstairs called Megatron Matrix by the artist Nam June Paik. It's 215 television screens, and it has two computer processors that basically process video, 8 channels of video and 2 channels of audio, and spreads it out across this large matrix of screens. It's a very delicate and complex piece. It requires an enormous amount of maintenance to keep it running on a daily basis. We think that it's really important. It's an important piece, part of our collection. It's an iconic, it's a primary artwork by this very important artist. So we think it's really important to present it to the public. And we have ongoing debates about whether or not, you know, we should pack it up and put it in storage and save it for the next 100 years. But in 10 years' time, the engineering knowledge to fix problems that come up with that on a daily basis is going to disappear. The engineers that we know of that are working in this now are getting older and they're going to retire. The schematics that we have on the televisions aren't really useful, you know, past a certain point. So if we keep it running now on a daily basis, we know that we're building up an additional institutional knowledge on keeping it running for as long as possible. And I know that the artist himself wrote extensively about some of this work. When it comes to the ends of its lifespan, it just dies. That's what happens when you can't preserve it anymore. But you know, we have an obligation to keep it running as long as possible, and we just have to keep our fingers crossed that, you know, we can build up we can train 15-year-old engineers to take over the reins in 20 years to keep these things working for us.
And in a situation like Michael described, what I'll say to Michael is, all right, can you please take pictures of the back of that and draw a diagram for my files to explain what you guys did to make it work? I'm very happy, but I know in 10 years, if you're not here, that will not be the case. So I think, again, we're not going to know what to do. But I think it gets back to what Rachel was describing about how there are so many people out there who've been generous and sharing this kind of information with one another. I think, collectors and users about how to fix things, how to troubleshoot. It sounds like that's really what's going on right now.
And that's sort of a matter of, if you're an institution collecting games, you should also collect sort of, these documents that users are generating. And in archives, we have a concept called representation information. What is necessary in order to be able to represent this later on down the line? So if you have, a JPEG 2000 image, you would point to the JPEG 2000 standard. So where available, we absolutely have an obligation to also holding the knowledge necessary to represent it in the future, whether that's hardware or software.
At this point, I guess we'll take one more question there, right in the middle, the back.
The people that make Doom release source code for very specific versions of Doom, but in a sense that effectively release the game to the public. So since the software by itself is only half of the equation to playing a game, do you think in some way in the future just releasing the game to the public will be a viable option in terms of preservation, or do you think at a certain point Nintendo will just release the ROMs for games so that people can at least play them, so that that's preserved, since playing them just in general is very difficult?
That has a very complicated answer.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So in general, I think releasing things to the public domain is great. The difficulty comes with what you are saying you are preserving. If you want to say that you are preserving Doom, there are approximately 4,000 versions of Doom, and the code that was released is a very different code than what went into the original game because of issues of licensing patents. So there are certain game mechanics that are operationalized completely differently in the public domain code than they were in the original game. So, if you're just trying to preserve gameplay, then sure, I think that's okay. If you're trying to maintain a history of id Software, is that adequate? No.
Well, I think this is a really good point, actually, to pause and say that our plan for this afternoon was to take a break now for a half hour, which would afford everyone the time to go up and see our Art of Video Games show, which is on the 3rd floor of the museum in this, I call it the northwest corner, or perhaps go to the cafe. And then at 3:15, we're resuming with our second panel. And our second panel is titled that it will address history and culture of gaming. We have some fabulous presenters. We heard from them this morning. Chris Melissinos, who curated the show, will be leading that panel. I encourage you to look at the bios of our speakers because I know a number of questions that came up will be addressed further then. The questions have been really great, so I hope we see you back here at 3:15. And I'd like you to maybe help me thank Michael, Rachel, and Dave for coming.